On this Tuesday night, the Taliban now back in full control of Afghanistan. A new, uncertain era begins.
We're trying very hard to get the Taliban to agree to allow people to leave safely.
How many Canadians have been left behind? Ballooning debt, how much should Canadians worry about balancing the books? He spent 11 years as Calgary's mayor. I talked to Nenshi about politics, Alberta's future, and the surge in COVID cases.
The Premier showed up on the proverbial aircraft carrier, unveiled the Mission Accomplished banner, and then went on vacation.
And rapid melt in the Rockies.
It's very depressing.
Why glaciers are retreating at a record rate.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
We are in Calgary, Alberta tonight, a place that owes its prosperity to oil and gas and, like economies everywhere, was brought to its knees by the pandemic. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Politically, this is conservative country. The Liberals were shut out of Alberta and Saskatchewan in the last federal election. Since then, simmering anger towards the Trudeau government has grown. But there's unhappiness, too, about Conservative Premier Jason Kenney, who has the lowest approval rating of any premier. There is an unsettled feeling here. We'll get to all of that in a moment, but we begin in Afghanistan, where for the first time in 2 decades, there are no U.S. troops on the ground. The Taliban is now in full control. This was Kabul airport today after the hasty American retreat. Taliban fighters declared victory on the tarmac and took stock of all that was left behind. The final hours of a lost war. The U.S. handed the country over to the same Islamist leaders it toppled in 2001. With the Americans gone and evacuation flights now finished, thousands of Afghans who helped Canada and other U.S. allies are stuck. The Taliban says it will allow Afghans with proper documents to leave the country, but that is no guarantee. Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight.
Major General Chris Donahue's name is now burned into history. The last American to leave Afghanistan after a 2-decade, $2 trillion war. 158 Canadian soldiers were among the tens of thousands who died, including almost 50,000 Afghan civilians alone. US President Joe Biden saying he made the decision to leave now, but there was plenty blame to go around for the disastrous and deadly exit.
That assumption that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a period of time beyond military drawdown turned out not to be accurate.
Canada is committing to resettle 20,000 of the most vulnerable. More than 2,000 were flown out in Canadian aircraft in the past 2 weeks. We now know 5,000 more who left on US planes will resettle in Canada too. A Canadian veterans group says it knows of at least 5,700 applicants who are still in Afghanistan. And the Canadian government says more than 1,200 Canadian citizens, permanent residents or family members also remain. For them, cold comfort from Ottawa.
Stay put, because the situation at this point is uncertain. And as we have described, we're trying very hard to get the Taliban to agree to allow people to leave safely.
Many are living in fear. One former interpreter told Global News the Taliban knows where his family is staying. One Afghan who may end up in Canada is TV news anchor Behishta Argand. She interviewed a Taliban spokesman just 2 days after the fall of Kabul. She now hopes they follow through on their promises to respect the rights of women and girls.
If they do what they promise, I think one day we have a very beautiful and good Afghanistan.
Her compatriots and the wider world are waiting too. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Canada still has a huge role to play in what happens to the people of Afghanistan. The only escape route now for those who want to leave is a dangerous journey to a land border, and who knows what will happen there. Afghanistan came up on the campaign trail again today. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, is traveling with the Liberals. David?
Well, Donna, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau continues to be dogged by questions about Afghanistan on the campaign trail. And today, he was pressed to commit to funding veterans, Canadian veterans, who in many cases are digging into their own pockets, trying to help those trying to flee the Taliban.
As this government did with Syrian refugees, we will continue to step up and work with all Canadians to make sure we are giving all the opportunities and all the support to Afghans fleeing violence.
Trudeau and his ministers have also said they are working with countries like Pakistan to process refugees who cross into that country. Nonetheless, the Trudeau government remains vague when it comes to specifics about how Canada will help. Now, as for campaign announcements, the Liberals are promising to transfer $1.2 billion more each year for the next 5 years to provinces and Indigenous communities for mental health programs.
I'm Abigail Bimman with the NDP campaign in Burnaby. Jagmeet Singh again focused on housing, promising to boost the taxable portion of capital gains profits on people who flip homes from 50 to 75%.
Very wealthy investors are using the housing market like a stock market.
The Liberals are also promising a home flipping tax, but have come under fire, including from the NDP, as documents show one of their Vancouver candidates has bought and sold 41 properties since 2005, turning $5 million in profit. Yes, you heard that right, 41. Late Tuesday, Taleeb Noormohamed issued a statement acknowledging he had, quote, business activities that would have been impacted by the Liberal plan, but he is fully supportive of it.
New Democrats are feeling optimistic in week 3. They have a full slate of candidates nationally, and just over half are women. In BC, the party is targeting at least 4 seats they think they can pick up, battling incumbents who are Liberal, Conservative, and Green.
I'm Mercedes Stevenson covering the Conservative campaign in Ottawa, where Erin O'Toole zeroed in on the historically high debt and deficit after unprecedented pandemic spending. O'Toole says if elected, a Conservative government would balance the budget within 10 years.
We will grow the economy so that we can get back to balance in a responsible and equitable way without cuts. That is our plan.
The Tories are steering clear of proposing cuts, arguing they can pay down the debt by growing the economy and slowing down the government spending Canadians have seen under the Liberals. But if a grow the economy plan sounds familiar, it's because it is. That's also the Liberal strategy for getting out of the red. The Tories are trying to capitalize on personal finance concerns, but the emphatic no cuts approach says something about the mood among voters. Donna?
All right, Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa, thanks. Here in Alberta, there was a sliver of good economic news today. The projected deficit is lower than expected, $7.8 billion instead of the $18 billion projected in the last budget. The government credits a partial economic recovery from COVID-19 and a rebound in the energy sector. But Alberta's debt, the total amount owing, has never been higher, more than $100 billion, and Canada's debt is now more than $1 trillion. Tonight, Jeff Semple looks at how worried Canadians should be about all that spending.
This University of Calgary student just spent 4 months looking for a part-time job.
And to say the least, it's been really tough.
The fourth-year economics major wants to be part of Alberta's energy transition, but says the pandemic has made the province's prospects even worse.
The ballooning debt is really getting out of control. I'm extremely worried for my future.
Over the course of COVID-19, Canada's deficit has grown faster than any other developed country. The debt forecast to hit $1.6 trillion this year. But unlike election campaigns past, no major party is promising to balance the books for at least a decade.
In the short term, that's of course quite understandable. The pandemic has resulted in an extraordinary level of expenditures.
Economists largely agree the pandemic spending spree is both necessary and manageable, thanks in part to record low interest rates.
Government debt is not like household debt. Governments can borrow over a very long time span. They don't necessarily ever need to fully repay that debt.
The economy is like a cup. The bigger it is, the more debt it can carry. This year, Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio is forecast to hit 51%, far less than during the 90s or the Second World War. Back then, the economy was smaller and drowning in debt. During the 1940s, the government sent more than 1 million Canadians to fight. To pay for it, Canada borrowed boatloads of cash. After the war, interest rates were also low, and Canada's economy emerged stronger than ever. So might history repeat?
We are in almost exactly the opposite situation now.
Economist Ian Lee was born in 1953 after his father returned from the war, one of 4 siblings, which was about the average for the time. Canada's birth rate today is 1.5.
We're almost at the other end of that continuum where the boomers are moving into retirement.
Lee says that aging population will send healthcare costs soaring, and our debt will make it harder to pay those bills.
We're not going to be able to borrow our way through this.
This former Bank of Canada governor says the next government should reduce spending and invest in a low-carbon economy.
We face a very real challenge in this country going forward as we have to make these investments.
And that transition, he says, is particularly challenging in Alberta.
I don't want to see governments just up and abandoning Alberta and leaving it to hang out to dry.
Justin Goda was born and raised in Calgary, but says he isn't sure how long he can afford to stay. Jeff Semple, Global News.
One transformation plan for the oil and gas industry coming up, how companies want Ottawa's help to make it happen. We are on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We're back in a moment. The oil and gas industry still employs hundreds of thousands of people in Alberta and contributes billions towards Canada's GDP. But the world is moving away from fossil fuels, and Alberta has to adapt. One plan is to scale up carbon capture. As Heather Yurix-West explains, Canada's 5 biggest oil producers have a plan but want billions in taxpayer investment to pull it off.
Since last summer, about 70% of the carbon dioxide produced at the NWR Sturgeon refinery has been pumped back into the ground. It's carried to a storage facility via a CO2 pipeline that took more than a decade and hundreds of millions of government dollars to build.
Without carbon capture and storage, we will never be able to meet our commitments.
But before this technology can make a real difference for Canada's emission reduction targets, carbon capture and storage projects need to be scaled up drastically and fast. In June, Canada's 5 largest oil production companies, Canadian Natural, Cenovus Energy, Imperial, Meg Energy, and Suncor, announced the Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero initiative. It's a plan to get the industry to net zero emissions by 2050, anchored by a multi-billion-dollar carbon capture and storage plan, one that would see an underground carbon corridor built between the company's Northern Alberta oil sands facilities and an underground storage hub near Cold Lake, Alberta.
There's nobody better to do this than the oil and gas companies, but it's going to take some time in order to put this together. I think, as they say, it may take a decade or two to make that all happen.
The proposal would reduce emissions by 68 megatons by 2050. That represents about 9% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. But at $75 billion, the plan is pricey, and the industry is not prepared to foot the bill alone. The energy giants declined our request for an interview until after the election. But in an interview before the election call with the Financial Times, Cenovus CEO Alex Pourbaix said Ottawa should pay up to 70%, more than $50 billion. Though a spokesperson for the group now says following the election, we look forward to working with the federal government to develop an achievable plan. Some analysts believe federal funds would be better spent elsewhere, particularly if, as many are predicting, we see the global demand for oil peak within 20 years.
It would make more sense to take that additional public funding and put it towards industries that are going to be part of the economy for in a carbon-constrained future for years to come.
Fossil fuels may no longer be the energy source of the distant future, but without a significant green transformation, the short-term viability of Canada's energy sector is also now at stake. Heather Yurix-West, Global News, Calgary.
Ahead, the dying glacier, why an iconic site in the Canadian Rockies will soon be history. You may have heard of the Peyto Glacier in the Canadian Rockies. The summer's record heat waves and fires have triggered an unprecedented melt. The Peyto Glacier is now retreating 10 times faster than it has in the last half-century. Jamie Dahl went to find out why and what scientists are now projecting.
It's horrific to see this almost unrecognizable from 1 year ago.
Few glaciers in the world have been monitored as long as this one. This picture dates back to the early 1900s. Since then, Pito Glacier has receded 3.5 kilometers. Dr. John Pomeroy first stepped foot on this ice in 2008. He came to better understand the hydrology of Pito Glacier and its neighbors, but he never imagined it could melt away in his lifetime.
I was horrified. We're basically seeing the glacier disintegrate very rapidly before our eyes. And I think we'll be documenting the end of this glacier over my career now.
This season, the ice melts are the highest ever recorded.
We could lose about 7 meters of ice off the glacier this year.
And the hundreds of burning wildfires, making it even worse.
So a lot of the soot from the wildfires has landed on the glaciers and darkened them up. And then the algae and the bacteria and viruses start growing on this stuff, and it darkens the glacier. And you see where it's accumulated here, the ice is melted faster than where there's less of it over here.
Just 13 years ago, this lake behind me was covered in ice. But what's even more astonishing is if I were to be standing on this surface 60 years ago, I would have been 200 meters higher.
I call the area at the top of the glacier the graveyard because that's where the glacier goes to die. That's really where we see the fastest change, the most change. It's melting really fast, it's changing really fast, and it's very depressing.
Pito is part of the headwaters to the North Saskatchewan River, a life source for so many across the prairie provinces.
You know, it's not impossible to imagine if we're losing ice at the rate that the Pito Glacier is losing ice this year, that our rivers would run dry in August or September. And this is like grievously serious for the future of life on the prairies. The world as we know it is being transformed as we watch.
This is not just affecting water supply and irrigation and hydropower, it's affecting the very nature of the Canadian Rockies and what they are. That's very sad, I think.
Dr. Pomeroy projects Pito will be gone within a decade, yet another casualty of a changing climate.
We're reaching a range of conditions outside of which our species developed. And so I hope we can preserve all of this.
Jamie Daw, Global News, Banff National Park.
I wanted to show you something, if you don't mind taking a peek at these. So this is 2010. I don't know if you remember.
I was so thin.
Next, I catch up with Naheed Nenshi after 11 years. What's changed for Calgary's first Muslim mayor? "11 years ago, it was national news when Naheed Nenshi was elected mayor of Calgary. With a master's degree from Harvard, he was the first Muslim mayor of a big Canadian city, and it was a signal that Calgary was more diverse and cosmopolitan than a lot of people thought. I first interviewed him back in 2010. Since then, he's dealt with a massive flood, a severe economic downturn, a climate crisis, the pandemic, and an increasingly toxic political atmosphere.
If I have to have a quick lunch, there's only one fast food place near my office. And nowadays, I am not allowed to walk to the A&W by myself.
Why not?
Too many, you never know who's going to talk to you, you never know who's going to confront you in that 1 block walk between my office and the A&W.
Where is all that anger come from? Is it the pandemic?
It's not the last year. This has been growing and growing and growing for at least the last 5 years. Partially is the weaponization of social media and false information and narratives. Part of it is politicians who have played with fire, who have thought, if I do a little bit of this, it'll help my vote, not realizing what they were unleashing, or maybe realizing what they were unleashing. So remember in 2015, well before Trump, we had a federal election here in Canada where the government of the time was running an explicitly anti-Muslim campaign. The Barbaric Cultural Practices Hotline, the niqab ban. And so it's a bit disingenuous to now say, oh, I don't know where this came from. Because when you blow the dog whistle, the dogs come.
Let me ask you about COVID. Cases are rising here in Alberta, going up fast. Hospitals are beginning to fill up again as well. Is the policy, do you think, just let her rip and we'll deal with the consequences?
Listen, I'm as shocked as anyone. The Premier showed up on the proverbial aircraft carrier, unveiled the mission accomplished banner, and then went on vacation. We thought he had solved COVID. Of course, we knew he hadn't solved COVID. And it is actually quite shocking, the dereliction of duty here by the provincial government.
Premier Kenney has not been seen in public for some time, not participating in the federal campaign at all. What do you make of that?
Well, it's obvious why he's not participating in the federal campaign. You know, in the previous federal campaign, he wasn't in Alberta very much because he thought he'd be very helpful to the Conservatives everywhere. And it's clear that, you know, political fortunes wane and wave. And in this case, he would probably be a major detriment to Mr. O'Toole's campaign. That said, I'd sure like him to be at work here in Alberta, and I'd sure like to see some real work being done so parents can feel safe about their kids going back to school.
What everybody is trying to figure out is, how does Alberta get back on its feet? How do you transition from oil and gas to renewables? How long does that take? Who's got the best plan for it?
So here's the critical piece. It's not about Alberta getting back on its feet. It's about Canada getting back on its feet. The federal government will never balance its budget unless Alberta is operating on all cylinders. And so it's important to all of us. And it frustrates me when I hear Canadians in other parts of the country saying, let them freeze, they'll sort themselves out, not realizing the impact that it's having on the entire country. There's nobody in any one of those buildings, in those oil company headquarters and energy company centers, that doesn't believe in climate change. There's nobody there that doesn't believe that we're in the midst of a very, very generational, epochal change, transition that we've got to get through. But ultimately, those are also the smartest people in energy in the world in those buildings. And there is no reason that that downtown that we're looking at cannot be the world center of clean energy. There is no reason why we cannot be leaders in the climate crisis rather than it being something that happens to us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with the soaring sights of Calgary's skyline. I'll see you again Thursday from Edmonton as we make our way across Canada during the federal election campaign. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.